The morning they came to take my father's ground, I was unloading 30 ducks onto 22 acres that 3 generations of my family had failed to farm. I want you to know something before I tell you the rest. The ducks were not my idea. They were my father's. He wrote it down in a nickel notebook in October of 1938 and died before he ever tried it. That is the kind of man he was. He thought of things 20 years before the world was ready for them and left them in a cedar chest for someone else to carry. A corporation with offices in 4 states had been watching that field for 2 years by the morning I opened the gate. They already had a patent. They already had lawyers. What they did not have and what they were not expecting was a 54-year-old piece of paper that made everything they had built into nothing. My name is Elias Boone. I was born on this land in 1943, and I expect to die on it, though I have never said that to anyone, including my wife June, because saying a thing like that out loud has a way of making people worry about you when what you want them to do is leave you alone to work. The farm sits 11 miles south of Bucyrus on a county road that does not carry enough traffic to keep the center stripe painted. 280 acres of it, most of it good ground. Black topsoil over clay. Subsoil, the kind of land that rewards the man who works it carefully and punishes the man who gets impatient. My grandfather broke this ground in 1909. My father worked it for 40 years after that. I've worked it for 30 years since, and in all that time, the southwestern corner of the property, 22 acres of low ground that sits in a shallow bowl between the main field and the creek, drainage has never once produced a crop worth talking about. My grandfather called it the problem. My father inherited that name for it along with the land itself, and I inherited it from my father. The ground was too low. In a wet March, water came in from the north field and from the drainage easement along the county road, and it pooled in that southwestern bowl, and it stayed there. Some years it drained by early May. In a bad year, it held until the middle of June, and by the time the soil was dry enough to work, the planting window had closed and the season was already decided against you. My grandfather tried surface drainage in 1921, cutting a shallow channel along the eastern edge toward the creek. The creek rose that spring and backed up through the channel and made things worse. My father laid drainage tile in 1958 and again in 1967. Both times the water found a way around or under what he had built. Patient in the way water is always patient, which is to say, absolutely and without any interest in what you want from it. I put in a 3rd run of drainage tile in 1981 and a 4th in 1988. After 1988, I stopped spending money on the problem and started spending time thinking about it instead, which cost less and produced about the same result. It was the summer of 1992 when everything changed, though I did not know it was changing at the time. My mother had passed in February of that year, a quiet passing the way she had lived, and in the weeks after the funeral, June and I went through the farmhouse room by room, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The hardest part of that kind of work is not the decisions themselves, but the pausing. You pick up a thing, and the thing holds a memory, and the memory holds you there for a moment longer than you intended, and the afternoon goes by and pauses. The trunks in the basement were the last thing. 4 of them stacked against the north foundation wall where the limestone sweated cold even in August. 3 held what you would expect: old clothes folded carefully smelling of cedar and thyme, a set of dishes wrapped in newspaper from 1951, some tools my grandfather had brought from Pennsylvania before the First War that were too old to use and too particular to throw away. The 4th trunk was cedar itself, dark and close-grained, with a latch that had gone green with age but still worked if you lifted the lid at the right angle. Inside at the bottom, under a folded wool blanket and a tin box of letters my father had written to my mother during the war, I found the notebook. It was a standard composition book, the kind that sold for a nickel at Woolworth's through the Depression and into the 40s, black and white marbled cover soft at the corners from years of pressure. My father's name was written inside the front cover in pencil, the handwriting careful and deliberate, the way his handwriting always was when he was writing something he expected someone else to read someday. Walter Boone, below the name, a date, October 1938. He would have been 23 that autumn, 2 years married to my mother, working ground that his own father had broken 30 years before. I sat down on the basement floor with my back against the cold stone wall, and I read it. Most of the notebook was what I expected. Farm account seed costs, the price of fuel and fertilizer equipment repairs logged in the same careful columns he kept all his life. A record of bushel yields by field going back to when he first took over the operation from my grandfather. His handwriting was small and even, and he never wasted a line. There was something almost satisfying about reading those pages the way a man's discipline shows itself in the smallest things. In the margins he kept in the way the numbers lined up without needing to be forced. I had seen that handwriting my entire life on grain receipts and equipment invoices and the backs of envelopes he used as scratch paper. Seeing it here in this notebook, preserved and careful in exactly itself, made him present in the room in a way that was harder to bear than his absence had been. The grief you think you have already passed can come back through something as small as a man's handwriting on a ledger page. But near the back of the notebook, separated from the accounts by 3 blank pages, as though my father had wanted some distance between the practical and the speculative, there were 8 pages written in a different hand. Faster, less careful, more like thinking than recording. He had written about a man named Harlan Cross. Cross was a retired agronomist from the University Extension Office in Columbus. He had come through Crawford County in the autumn of 1938, part of a circuit the Extension Service ran through the rural counties every few years, talking to farmers about soil management and crop rotation and the particular problems of low ground in the Midwest. He had walked my father's land on a gray October afternoon and stood at the edge of the southwestern bowl, the same 22 acres that had refused 3 generations of us, and he had told my father something that my father wrote down word for word in quotation marks, which told me he had understood at the moment of hearing it, that the words mattered even if he could not yet say how. Ducks work wet ground the way a plow works dry ground. They press the soil, they break the surface crust, they eat what competes with what you want to grow, and they leave behind what the soil needs to feed itself. The practice is old, older than anything we have in our extension bulletins. We have spent 2 generations convincing ourselves we know better, and our drainage bills show it. My father had written beneath the quotation in his own voice, "Sounds like something a man says when he has run out of practical suggestions." But Cross has walked 60 years of ground, and he does not say things sideways. On the next page he had written a list of questions. What breed of duck for flat, wet ground? How many birds per acre to start? How you manage the water if you want to plant into it after the birds come out. He had written a number, 30 birds per acre is the figure Cross gave. And at the bottom of that page, smaller than the rest, as though he had almost not written it at all, "We'll need to look at J. Crawford Agricultural Society, Volume 4, 1939. Cross said his full method is written there." I sat on that basement floor for a long time after I finished reading. I had known about the 22 acres my entire working life. I'd spent money on it and time on it, and I had failed at it the same way my father had failed at it and his father before him. And here was my father 54 years ago, standing at the edge of that same ground with a man telling him the answer was not a machine and not a chemical and not another run of drainage tile. The answer was 30 ducks, and my father had written it down. He had written it down carefully. In a notebook he kept with the same discipline he brought to every other piece of farm business, and he had written the follow-up reference at the bottom of the page as though he fully intended to look it up. And then he had put the notebook in a cedar trunk, and the cedar trunk in a basement, and the answer had sat there for 54 years waiting for someone to come down the stairs and ask the right question. I thought about my father the way you think about a man when you have just found something he left for you without knowing he was leaving it. He had never talked to me about the low corner in any way that suggested he had a solution waiting. He had walked it with me in wet springs and dry springs, and shaken his head the same way I had shaken mine, and I had assumed his shaking was the same as mine, which was resignation. Now I understood it was something else. It was the particular frustration of a man who knows the answer and cannot yet see his way to using it. He had been waiting too. He just ran out of time before the waiting finished. I closed the notebook. I sat there a few more minutes with my hands resting on top of it, feeling the soft corners of the marbled cover, the slight give of paper that has been pressed under weight for a long time. Then I carried it upstairs and put it on the kitchen table and looked at it while the coffee finished brewing. June came in from the garden and looked at the notebook and looked at me and did not ask anything. Because after 26 years of marriage, she had learned which silences meant I was working something out and which meant something was wrong, and she could tell the difference. I put the notebook in the bookcase in the front room that night, not back in the cedar trunk, in the bookcase where I could see it from my chair. And then I did not open it again for 2 years. That is not as strange as it sounds. A man who has farmed his whole life understands that timing is a kind of knowledge. You do not plant before the soil is ready, no matter how much you want the season to start. I knew what was in that notebook. I needed to sit with it long enough to know whether I believed it or whether I was only hoping. Those are not the same thing, and mixing them up is how a farmer makes his worst decisions. But those 2 years were not empty years. I thought about the notebook more than I talked about it, which is to say, I thought about it constantly and talked about it with no one. I walked the low corner differently after reading it, with a different kind of attention. I had always walked it the way you walk ground. You have already decided about looking for confirmation of what you already knew. Now I walked it looking for what I did not know, which is a different kind of looking entirely. I started noticing things I had stopped seeing because I had decided they were simply what the ground was, rather than information the ground was trying to give me. I noticed the way the sedge grass grew in specific patterns that did not follow the fence line or the slope, but followed something underneath the surface. I noticed how certain areas dried faster than others after a wet week in a way that did not correspond to the elevation I had always assumed explained it. I noticed that the cattails, which I had always considered the enemy, grew thickest in exactly the places where the soil probe met the most resistance, as though the roots had found the same hard layer and were working along it, the way a crack follows the fault in a stone. A field teaches a man who is willing to be taught. I had farmed that corner for 20 years, as though I already knew everything it had to say. Reading those 8 pages in my father's handwriting opened a space in my understanding that I had not known was closed, and the 2 years I spent thinking about what to do next were not wasted. They were the time the idea needed to become something more than an idea. They were the time I needed to stop being certain I knew the problem and start being willing to see what the ground was actually asking for. It was October of 1993, a Thursday evening, when I finally said it out loud. June and I were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last of the light go out of the western sky. The air had that particular autumn smell of cooling soil and drying cornstalks and wood smoke from somewhere up the road. I told her about the notebook, all of it, cross in the quotation and the 30 birds per acre and the journal reference at the bottom of the page. I talked for a long time. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without the slight impatience that most people cannot keep entirely out of their face when someone else is talking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the dark field. Then she said, "How many acres are we talking about?" "Not are you sure?" "Not where did you read that?" "Not Elias, we have tried everything on that ground. Just how many acres?" I told her 22, the low corner, the ground that flooded in March and stayed wet into June. She nodded slowly in the dark. She said, "That is not nothing, but it is not everything either. What does it cost to start?" I told her I didn't know yet. That was honest. What I knew was what the notebook said and what Cross had told my father, which was that the real work was not the ducks themselves. It was the water. You had to be able to move the water deliberately, flood a section when you needed it flooded and drain it when you needed it dry. And without that control, the idea was nothing. Just ducks standing in a swamp, which is not farming. It is just owning ducks. I ordered 30 Muscovy ducks from a hatchery in central Indiana in the first week of February 1994. I spent the rest of that winter working on the water management problem. I drew rough diagrams on graph paper at the kitchen table after supper. I walked the low corner in February when the ground was frozen hard enough to hold my weight, and I studied where the water came from and where it went, and what the ground was trying to tell me about itself that I had not been listening to carefully enough. What I found surprised me. The water, when it came in a wet spring, did not spread evenly the way I had always assumed. It followed a shallow depression that ran diagonally across the field from the northwest corner down toward the drainage easement on the east edge. Not a channel exactly. More like a long, soft crease in the ground, maybe 8 inches lower at its deepest point than the surrounding surface. You would not notice it walking in summer. The corn grew across it without complaint. But in wet years, that crease filled first and drained last. And it was the reason certain rows in that corner had always yielded thin, while the rows around them came in strong. I had farmed that corner for 20 years and never understood why until I stood in it in February with the water pattern frozen into the surface where I could finally read it. I marked the crease with fence stakes, driving them in with a hand maul while my breath came out in small clouds. 17 stakes in a line that curved gently across the field. Standing back and looking at them, I could see the whole 22 acres differently. The crease was not a flaw I had inherited. It was information I had not known how to read. And the fact that it had taken me 20 years to read it was not a failure of observation. It was a failure of assumption. I had come to this ground already knowing what it was, and that knowing had made me blind to what it was actually doing. My father had seen it the same way. So had his father before him. The crease had been there all along, patient and available, waiting for the generation that would finally stop being certain long enough to look. I called the county road commissioner in early March, not the extension office. The road commissioner because the man I wanted to talk to about drainage was the man who managed the county drainage easement along my east fence line. I drove to the county road office on a Thursday morning and explained what I was planning. A small earthen berm along the north and east edges of the low corner, a wooden riser pipe for water control, a gravity drain to the easement at the southwest outlet point. Simple structures. Nothing requiring an engineer's stamp, the kind of thing farmers had been building in wetland impoundments across the South for generations. The road commissioner was a heavy man who had grown up 2 townships over and understood low ground the way men who grow up around it always do in their bones rather than from a textbook. He asked 2 questions. Where exactly the berm would sit relative to the drainage easement and whether I could drain the impoundment before spring runoff. I answered both honestly. He thought for a moment and said that as long as I kept the easement clear and the outlet functional, he saw no conflict with the county's maintenance obligations. I drove home with that in my pocket. The berm went up through March and into early April. I used the 1974 International Utility Tractor with a 3-point blade, the same machine I had used for 30 years on work that did not require anything fancier. My father had taught me to build earthen structures in lifts, packing each course before adding the next, letting the material settle between passes. He had built the pond on the North 40 in 1961, using exactly that method, and it was still holding water 30 years later. I worked 3 hours in the morning before the frost came out of the ground too soft, then stopped. By the 17th of March, I had a berm along the north and east edges that stood 22 inches at its crown and was packed firm enough to walk without sinking. There is something satisfying about earthwork done by hand and machine together. The way the tractor blade moves the material and the compaction comes from the rear wheels, and the human judgment guides both. It is one of the older forms of farming knowledge, how to read, whether a lift has dried enough to accept another course, how to feel through the seat of a tractor when the ground beneath is behaving the way you need it to. My father had taught me this the same way he had taught me everything else about this farm. Not with formal instruction, but by doing it alongside me until I understood it in my hands rather than my head. Building that berm, I thought about him more than I had expected to. The tractor was the same machine he had run. The method was his. The only thing that was mine was the reason. The ducks arrived the second week of April, 30 of them in ventilated cardboard boxes from the Indiana hatchery. They were loud and opinionated, and they had the red warty skin around their eyes that makes people who do not know Muscovies take a step back the first time they see them. They do not quack either. They hiss and grunt, which does nothing for their reputation with people who form opinions quickly. I put them in a temporary pen near the barn and went back to finishing the outlet pipe installation. It was a Tuesday morning, the 3rd week of April. Low clouds, the smell of thawed earth, the particular stillness that comes over a farm before the season declares itself. I had the 30 ducks loaded in crates in the bed of the F-25, a 1972 with rust along both rocker panels and a tailgate that required a particular sideways lift to close. I backed down the county road, shoulder to the gate of the low corner, and was unloading crates when I heard a truck slow behind me. Dale Mercer pulled his white Chevrolet C10 cleaner than his kitchen to a stop on the shoulder and rolled his window down. Dale farmed the ground 3/4 of a mile to the east. He was 58 years old and had an opinion about most things and the patience to share it without being asked. He looked at the crates. He looked at the field behind the fence, standing in 8 inches of water that caught the April light in flat silver panels. He looked at me. Then he smiled, not cruelly. It was the smile men use when they have already decided you are wrong, but are willing to watch you prove it in person. He said, "Elias, what exactly are you doing with 30 fat ducks on 40 acres of standing water?" I told him I was farming. He laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from honest amusement at something that cannot possibly go the way its author imagines. He rolled the window up and drove on. 2 other men stopped that morning. A farmer from up the road who asked if I was aware Muscovies could carry disease that would spread to neighboring poultry flocks, which was not accurate, but was the kind of thing a man says when he wants to sound practical about something he simply does not believe in. A second man who wanted to know whether I had spoken to anyone at the extension office before doing this. A third neighbor saw me from across the field and waved without stopping. I took that as the most efficient form of skepticism available. By noon, according to June, who had driven into town for groceries, the diner on the main street already had a version of the story. In the diner's version, I apparently owned 50 ducks and had been advised by a veterinarian in Columbus who specialized in alternative farming methods. Neither of these things was true, but neither was particularly interesting to correct. I opened the gate at the southwest corner that afternoon and stepped back. The ducks did not rush. That surprised me. Instead, the lead bird's 3 older drakes, who had sorted themselves into a kind of loose authority over the weeks in the barn pen, walked to the water's edge and stopped. They stood there reading the field the way a man reads ground he has not worked before, measuring it, deciding whether it was what they had been waiting for. Then one waded in. Then the others followed in a long, unhurried file the way cattle walk into a pond in summer. Within 20 minutes, all 30 were working the shallows' bills, sweeping side to side through the soft-bottom sediment tails tipped up, moving in slow, overlapping circles. I watched them for 2 hours. I watched them locate things I could not see, insect larvae in the mud seeds of sedgegrass and water dock that had been establishing in that soil for years. Small invertebrates working the bottom I could not have named. Every sweep of the bill was purposeful. Every step disturbed the bottom just enough to cloud the water and bring whatever lived there up into reach. They did not waste emotion. They moved with the patience of things that have been doing one job for a very long time and have no intention of doing it differently. By the end of the first week, the water had turned dark and turbid from their constant working. That was the point. My father had written it in the notebook, quoting Cross, "Let them dirty the water. Dirty water is working water." The nutrients from the bottom soil were now suspended, circulating, available. The field was beginning to feed itself from the inside. I thought about my father often during those early weeks. I wondered whether he had ever stood at the edge of the low corner on one of those gray October afternoons after his conversation with Cross, and imagined what it would look like with water in it and birds working it. Whether he had drawn the picture in his mind and then folded it up and put it away because the circumstances were not right and the timing was not ready. A man in 1938 with 3 children and a farm coming out of the Depression did not have the capital or the risk tolerance for an experiment that might fail. He could afford to write it down. He could not afford to try it. So he wrote it down instead, and he wrote it carefully, and he kept it in a notebook that he put in a cedar trunk in a basement where it would wait for whoever came after him with the time and the stubbornness to open the lid at the right angle and read all the way to the back. I was the one who came after him. That was not a burden. It was a privilege, the kind that takes a person some time to understand as such. It was the 14th of May, 3 weeks after I had moved the ducks in, when the county extension agent came out unannounced, a woman in her late 30s with a clipboard careful manner and the specific expression of someone who has been sent to deliver a concern and would prefer not to. She told me at the gate the office had received a complaint about standing water and potential mosquito breeding on my property. I walked her out to the field. She wrote things on her clipboard and looked at the ducks working the shallows. She asked about permits for waterfowl cultivation at this scale. I told her they were domestic birds. She asked about the berm structure and whether it had county approval. I told her I had spoken directly with the road commissioner in March and gave her his name. She wrote something down. She said she would follow up. That evening I sat on the porch and felt something I had not anticipated feeling, which was doubt. Not about the ducks. Not about my father's notebook or Cross's method. The doubt was about whether the world outside the fence line would give the thing inside it enough time to finish what it had started. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from work, but from having to explain the work while you are still in the middle of doing it. I had been farming this ground for 30 years, and I had never once been asked to justify what I was doing by a neighbor or a county official. The act of asking changes something between people that cannot be entirely changed back. You can answer the question correctly and still feel the cost of having been asked. June brought 2 cups of coffee out and sat in the chair beside mine without being asked. She did not ask what I was thinking. She already knew. After a while, she said the berm held through that rain last week. I said it had. She said I watched them from the back window this afternoon. She paused. They know what they're doing. I nodded. We sat there until the dark came all the way in, and the only sounds were the frogs starting up in the low ground, and beneath that, softer, the movement of 30 ducks working the shallow water in the dark, the way they had worked it all day, unhurried, indifferent to the hour, indifferent to everything except the task directly in front of them. There was something steadying about that sound. The world outside the fence line could have whatever opinion it wanted. The field was doing what the field needed to do on its own schedule by its own logic, and the only job a farmer has in relation to a process that is already working is to not interfere with it. What I did not know that evening was that we were not the only ones watching. The county road along the north edge of my property does not carry much traffic. A school bus in the mornings, farm equipment in planting season and harvest, the occasional neighbor heading into town. I knew the sound of most of those engines the way you know any sound that belongs to your place. The engine I heard slow on the road at dusk that evening was not a sound I knew. A heavy engine, not a farm truck idling briefly at the north fence line. By the time I stood up and looked, the road was empty, but the gravel on the shoulder showed where a vehicle had stopped, and the tire width pressed into the soft shoulder was wider than anything a neighbor would be driving. I did not know what Agravast Corporation was at that moment. I had no reason to. It would be 2 years before a man named Preston Gallagher pulled into my drive in a dark SUV and explained with practiced patience that my 22 acres of low ground had become something a corporation with offices in 4 states had decided it needed to own. But that is the nature of things moving toward you in the dark. They do not announce themselves. They idle at the fence line and pull away before you can see what they are. And by the time you understand what was watching you, it has already been watching longer than you knew. By the spring of 1995, the 22 acres had stopped being a question. It had become a record. Elias had started a green hardcover ledger that Winter bought at the hardware store in Bucyrus, and he filled it the way his father had filled the one before it, in columns and dates and measured observations. The handwriting was less careful, but the discipline was the same. He was not trying to prove anything to anyone outside the fence line. He was trying to understand what was happening inside it. Dale Mercer did not stop to laugh in the second season. He slowed on the county road twice that Elias noticed looking out at the field from the cab of the C-10, but he did not roll the window down. That was a different thing from believing. But it was also a different thing from laughing, and Elias understood the distance between those two positions, because he had stood in it himself for 2 years before placing the order with the Indiana hatchery. The distance between doubting and knowing is not always a straight line. Sometimes it is a slow drift. One observation at a time until a man finds himself on the other side of the question without having made a single conscious decision to cross it. That was how it worked with Dale, and it was how it had worked with Elias himself. The extension office did not come back. The road commissioner passed one morning in early May, raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel, the way men do on rural roads when they know everyone on them, and kept going. The world for a time left Elias Boone alone with his 22 acres and his 30 ducks and a green ledger filling up with numbers that were beginning slowly and without drama to say something worth hearing. What no one driving past that fence line could see in the spring of 1995 was what was happening 4 inches below the surface of that shallow water. The compaction layer, the hard pan that 3 generations of Boones had thrown drainage tile against without result, was beginning to fracture. Not along its entire width, not uniformly. It was breaking in the corridors where the ducks moved most consistently. Along the margins, they returned to again and again in their slow, deliberate working of the bottom. The fractures were small. A soil scientist would have needed instruments to measure them that first season. But they were there, deepening with every day the birds worked the water above them, 30 sets of feet applying and releasing weight across the same ground 10,000 times a day, doing what no machine had been able to accomplish, because no machine had the patience to apply small pressure repeatedly across an entire surface for months at a time. Elias did not know this yet in the way that can be proven, but he suspected it the way a farmer suspects things through his boots and his hands, and the particular quality of resistance he felt when he pushed his soil probe into the ground in the southeast quarter and compared it to what the probe had told him a year before. He wrote the numbers in the green ledger without interpretation. He let them do their own talking. It was the 3rd weeks of June in the second season when Raymond Keller came out for the first time. Keller was the drainage engineer for Crawford County, 34 years old, the kind of man who carried a tripod and a case of instruments to a farm, visit the way a doctor carries a bag. He had been sent, he explained at the gate, following up on a concern the office had logged about standing water and impoundment structures on private agricultural land. He said it in the careful, neutral language of a man who has learned to deliver official purposes without apology and without aggression. Elias walked him out to the field without saying anything beyond what was necessary. Keller spent 40 minutes taking measurements. He pushed his probe into the ground at 8 or 9 points across the southeast quarter, entered readings into a tablet, crouched once, and pressed his palm flat against the surface. It was the same gesture Elias's father had used with uncertain soil, the reading through the hand that instruments cannot fully replace, and Elias noticed it without commenting. When Keller came back to the fence line, he looked at his tablet for a long moment. He said the water table had dropped measurably from the county's baseline survey. He said the compaction layer flagged in the county's 1987 drainage survey as effectively permanent without mechanical intervention was showing signs of disruption at 4 of his 8 probe points. He said he was not certain what had caused it. He looked at the ducks, then working the eastern margin in their slow, overlapping circles. Bills sweeping the bottom water, clouding and clearing in their wake. He said it quietly, almost to himself. Those birds are doing something to your hard pan. Elias didn't respond. He let the observation sit between them. A man who has spent 3 seasons being laughed at for a thing learns the value of allowing someone else to say the thing first. Keller asked how long the birds had been running on that section. Elias told him. Keller made a note. He asked whether Elias had documentation of when the compaction layer had first been mapped on this parcel. Elias told him his father's notebook put the first notation in October 1938 and that the county's own survey in 1987 had measured the layer at between 14 and 18 inches depth across the full southeast quarter. He mentioned there was also a reference in the notebook to a publication from the Crawford County Agricultural Society, Volume 4, from 1939, by an agronomist named Harlan Cross that he had not yet located. Keller wrote that down slowly, making sure he had it right. They walked back to the farmhouse. June set coffee on the kitchen table and went back to the garden without a word. Keller turned the pages of Walter Boone's composition notebook with the careful attention of someone handling something older than its appearance suggested. He asked questions. Elias answered them. When Keller left an hour later, he said he would be in touch, and he said it in a way that sounded like more than a formality. 3 days later, Elias drove to the building on the east side of Bucyrus that had housed the Crawford County Agricultural Society until the organization folded in 1962. It was now a county storage facility, its upper floor given over to filing cabinets and cardboard boxes accumulated over 30 years of county business not important enough for the courthouse but too official to discard. The woman at the front desk was not sure what he was looking for. He showed her the notation in his father's notebook. J. Crawford Agri Society, Volume 4, 1939. She made a phone call. A man came down and took Elias up a narrow staircase into a room that smelled of old paper and a particular kind of institutional patience, the smell of things that have been waiting a long time for someone to come looking. It took 40 minutes to find it. The journal was smaller than Elias had imagined. A thin, staple-bound publication, the cover print faded to the color of old straw. Crawford County Agricultural Society Proceedings, Volume 4, Spring 1939. The article by Harlan Cross ran to 11 pages. It described in precise agronomic language the method Cross had outlined to Walter Boone on that gray October afternoon, 6 years before the article's publication. The method his father had written in quotation marks in a nickel composition book and stored in a cedar trunk for 53 years. Elias stood in that upstairs room and read all 11 pages. He read them once for content and once more slowly, the way he read anything that mattered, looking for what was between the lines, as much as what was in them. Cross wrote the way men of that generation wrote when they were describing something they had observed themselves, precisely and without flourish, with the specific confidence of a man who does not need to persuade because he knows the thing he is describing is true. He gave measurements. He gave timelines. He gave the names of duck breeds and the reasoning behind each recommendation. He described the biological mechanism of soil compaction, relief in language that a farmer could follow. And he noted at the end of the article that the method had been in use in various forms in delta agricultural regions for centuries, and that the principle underlying it, repeated low-pressure mechanical disturbance of a compaction layer, combined with organic nutrient cycling, was not novel, but had been overlooked in American agricultural practice in favor of mechanical drainage solutions that were more expensive and less effective. Elias stood in that room and thought about his grandfather. He thought about all the money 3 generations of Boones had spent on drainage tile that had done nothing, and about the 53 years this 11-page article had sat on a shelf in a county storage room, while those tile runs went in and failed and were replaced. He was not angry. Anger was not the right word for what he felt. It was something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that the gap between an available answer and a used answer can be a lifetime wide, and that most of the time no one is to blame for the width of it. The knowledge was here, the need was there. The distance between them was just the ordinary distance of things that have not yet found each other. He asked whether he could get a photocopy. He drove home with it folded in the breast pocket of his work jacket. That evening he put it in the green ledger between 2 pages of probe readings and set the ledger on the kitchen table. He made supper, and they ate, and he did not say anything until June asked him directly what he was thinking. He told her he had found the Cross article. She set her fork down. She said all 11 pages. He said all 11 pages. She looked at the ledger on the table. Then she looked at him. She did not say what either of them was already thinking, because some things do not need to be said between people who have been paying attention to the same thing for 2 years. She got up from the table and went to the bookcase in the front room and came back with the composition notebook, the one with the black and white marbled cover, and she set it on the table next to the green ledger. 2 notebooks on a kitchen table in Ohio, 56 years apart, the same knowledge traveling forward through time looking for someone who would use it. She looked at both of them for a moment without saying anything. Then she sat back down and picked up her fork. That was all that needed to happen. That was enough. It was the 14th of June in the 3rd season, the summer of 1996, when the berm failed. The rain began on a Thursday evening, ordinary at first, then heavy after midnight and relentless. Elias woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he could not immediately place, a low continuous pressure, different from rain on the roof and different from wind against the windows. He lay still and listened. Then he understood and was out of the bed before he had fully decided to move. June was already in the bedroom window looking south toward the low corner. She had heard it before he had. She said the east berm. He was already pulling on his boots. The east berm had failed at its lowest point, where the ground beneath had been saturated longest and the lift packing had been least thorough. A section 12 feet wide had given way, and water was moving through the gap in a steady, dark sheet, spreading across the adjacent field toward the county drainage easement. In the darkness, Elias could hear the ducks, but not see them. He moved along the fence line with a flashlight, trying to assess how fast the impoundment was draining. The answer was fast, too fast. He went to the equipment shed for sandbags. He was carrying the second load to the breach when he heard a truck on the county road slow and turn into the lane. Dale Mercer came through the gate in a canvas work coat and rubber boots, carrying his own flashlight. He did not explain what he was doing there or how he had known to come. He looked at the breach, looked at the water moving through it, looked at Elias, and went to work. They worked until 3:40 in the morning. They did not talk except to say what needed to be said about the work itself. Dale knew how to handle sandbags and how to work a breach, and he did not require instruction. He worked with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a man who understands that a crisis is simply a problem that has run out of patience, and that the right response to it is to do the next necessary thing without theater. Elias thought about many things during those 2 hours in the rain, and none of them were about the berm or the ducks or the field. He thought about what it meant that Dale Mercer was here. This was the man who had laughed on the county road shoulder 2 springs ago with genuine amusement and zero malice and had driven on. This was the man who had slowed twice the following season and not stopped. And now he was here in the dark and the rain, moving sandbags without being asked and without explanation and without any acknowledgement that the laughter had ever happened. Elias understood this to be one of the more honest things a man could do. Not an apology, because what Dale had done did not require an apology. A recognition of what the work was, of what it meant that the work was still happening, of what kind of man continues when the work gets hard in the middle of the night in the rain. Elias had farmed beside Dale Mercer for 30 years. He knew him the way farmers know each other in a county where the same families have worked the same ground for generations, which is to say deeply but often without words. You knew a man's work before you knew his opinions. You knew how he treated equipment and fences and the shared drainage easements between properties. You knew whether his fields looked the way they should look in October, whether his buildings held paint, whether his cattle were in good condition going into winter. These things told you more about a man than his conversation could, and Elias had known for 30 years that Dale Mercer was a man whose fields told the right story even when his mouth said the wrong thing. The laugh on the county road had been his mouth. The canvas coat and the flashlight and the 40 minutes in the rain were his fields. When the breach was stabilized, they stood at the edge of the field in the thinning rain. Elias counted the ducks by flashlight. All 30 were accounted for, gathered in the northwest corner where the water was still at the depth they preferred. Dale looked out at the field for a moment. He said the kink in the east section, packed it too tight on top without enough base. Water found it. Elias said he knew. Dale said nothing more. He walked back to his truck and drove the 3/4 of a mile home. He did not wait to be thanked. Elias did not call after him because both men understood that what had just passed between them was of a different order than the kind that requires acknowledgement. Elias stood at the breach for a while after Dale's taillights disappeared. The rain had thinned to a mist. The ducks were already quiet again in their corner. The water in the impoundment had stopped moving through the gap, held now by the sandbags, and the field beyond was dark and still under the soft mist. He thought about everything that had been required to get to this moment. The 54 years between his father writing in a nickel notebook and Elias opening the gate on a Tuesday in April. The 2 years he had spent sitting with the idea before he said it out loud. The months of planning and the weeks of earthwork and the 3 seasons of observation. All of it had led here, to standing in the dark at 2 in the morning with mud on his boots and a breach in his berm and 30 ducks in the corner who had not stopped working even when their world fell apart for a few hours. He didn't find any of this discouraging. He found it clarifying. A thing that could not be stopped by a failure was a thing that was worth continuing. Elias rebuilt the east berm over the following 3 weeks alone with less money than he would have preferred because the first construction had used most of what he had budgeted and the remainder had gone into seed and feed through the winter. He packed the new section in shorter lifts, letting each course dry a full day before adding the next. He had built the first berm with confidence. He was building this one with knowledge. It was slower and it held better, and it would continue to hold better for all the time he worked that ground. The 3rd season ended in late September with the clearest water he had seen in the impoundment since opening day. The probe readings showed the compaction layer had fractured at 7 of 12 monitoring points. The fractures were deepest in the movement corridors, the paths the birds returned to most reliably, and the pattern matched almost exactly the crease he had marked with 17 stakes in the frozen February of 1994. He was standing at the south fence line with the probe in his hand and the ledger open on the fence post when he heard a vehicle come slowly down the county road and turn into the lane. The SUV was a deep charcoal color that in the late afternoon light looked almost black. The logo on the door showed a stylized sheaf of grain with the letters Agrivast beneath it. The man who stepped out was 39 years old, dressed in a gray suit jacket over a collared shirt without a tie, the costume of someone who had decided the missing tie communicated approachability while the jacket communicated authority. His boots were rubber black and unmarked, the kind bought specifically for visits like this one, and never broken in, carrying the stiffness of things that have not yet learned what ground they are standing on. His name was Preston Gallagher. He offered his card with one hand, and a handshake practiced enough to be a skill with the other. Agrivast Corporation Regional Land Acquisition Director, Wharton, MBA, Columbus office. A phone number with a prefix that did not belong to Crawford County. He looked at the field. He looked at the ducks working the far margin. He looked back at Elias with the patient half-smile of a man who has decided the conversation is a formality before an inevitable conclusion. He said, "I have to hand it to you. Most people would have tiled this corner again and called it a loss." The phrasing was designed to sound like a compliment. Elias heard what it actually was, which was the assessment of someone who had already decided the experiment was over and wanted to buy it at experiment prices. He had encountered this kind of sentence before, usually from implement dealers and crop insurance adjusters. People who needed you to feel slightly grateful before they told you what they had decided your situation was worth. The sentence was a tool. So was the half-smile. So was the absence of a tie. All of it was designed to move a transaction forward by making the other party feel seen before they understood what was being taken. He said, "What number are you carrying?" Gallagher said 1.4 million for the full 280 acres. He said it the way men say large numbers when they have practiced not being attached to them flatly, as though the figure were a piece of information rather than an argument. Elias looked at the field. The ducks were in the southeast corner working the margin in the late afternoon light, the water surface catching the sun in the particular way it did at that hour when it was disturbed just enough to break the reflection into small moving points. He thought about his grandfather arriving in Crawford County in 1909 with a team of horses and a plan. He thought about his father standing at the edge of this same ground on a gray October afternoon in 1938, listening to a man named Cross, and writing it down that night because it mattered even if he did not yet know how. He He thought about the pond on the North 40 that his father had built in 1961, in lifts packing each course before adding the next, and which was still holding water 35 years later. He thought about the 17 fence stakes tracing the crease across the low corner, the crease that 3 generations of Boones had walked across without reading. He thought about a nickel notebook in a cedar trunk in a basement, waiting for the right person to open it at the right angle. $1.4 million. He understood what it meant that the number was that large. It did not mean Agravast was generous. It meant the land was worth considerably more than that to them, and they were offering a number designed to feel large to a farmer and small enough to leave room for what they actually needed. He had been farming long enough to recognize a price set at the edge of what someone hopes you do not know you have. He said, "This land has been in my family since 1909. Gallagher nodded slowly. He said Agravast had tremendous respect for agricultural heritage. He said they structured agreements to honor families with deep ties to the land. Elias looked at Gallagher's boots. The soles were clean, not the clean of a man who had been careful, the clean of a man who had never stood on anything that would mark them. He thought about every morning he had walked this fence line before the light came up, probe in hand, numbers in a column, the cold coming through the soles of boots that had stood on every kind of weather this county produced for 30 years. He thought about what his father's boots must have looked like. He thought about his grandfather's boots, the ones that had crossed from Pennsylvania and broken the first furrow in 1909. The Boone family had been leaving marks on this ground for 85 years. Gallagher's boots had not yet touched it. He said, "I'm not selling." Gallagher's expression did not change in any meaningful way. He nodded with the patience of a man who has developed a professional relationship with the word no and does not take it personally because he does not intend it to be final. He said the offer remained open. He said Agravast would be in the area for some time. He drove back down the lane and north toward Bucerus, and Elias stood at the fence and watched the taillights until the road curved and they were gone. Then he looked back at the field. The ducks had not stopped working while any of that was happening. They didn't know about Agravast Corporation or patent portfolios or regional grain storage corridor development plans. They knew about the 8 inches of water over the southeast quarter and the bottom of it and what lived there. And they were attending to that knowledge the way they always did, without distraction, without argument, without the particular kind of impatience that comes from believing you already know the outcome. He didn't tell June about the visit until after supper. He set the business card on the kitchen table between them, and she looked at it without picking it up. She said they had been watching for a while. He said he thought so. She said, "What do they want with the wet corner?" He said he didn't know yet. He said he intended to find out. What Agravast wanted with the wet corner became clearer over the following months, arriving in pieces the way difficult things usually do. Gallagher had visited 3 other farms along the county road that same week, and word moved through the township the way all news moved in that part of Ohio, directly and faster than the people involved would have preferred. Agravast was acquiring land in a corridor running north to south through the center of the county, and the corridor aligned almost exactly with the route of a proposed regional grain storage facility that had been under discussion with the county commissioners for 2 years. The facility would require flat parcels with existing agricultural infrastructure, good road access, and reliable drainage. The Boone property sat at the center of the corridor. The 22 acres of low ground that Elias was reclaiming sat on top of the single drainage easement the proposed facility would need to tie into. He understood this the evening he read the commissioners' meeting minutes at the courthouse in Bucerus. He sat at the kitchen table with the minutes in front of him and worked through the geography until the picture assembled itself clearly. Then he closed the documents and sat for a while. What he understood sitting there was not simply that Agravast wanted the land. He already knew that. What he understood now was why the 22 acres mattered specifically, and why Gallagher had described the impoundment as an interesting experiment, in the tone of a man who had already decided the experiment was a complication rather than an asset. If the drainage easement on the east edge of the low corner was the key infrastructure for the proposed facility, then any established water management system on that easement was a legal and engineering problem that would cost money and time to work around. The more developed the impoundment became, the more expensive it became to remove. Agravast was watching the clock the same way Elias was. The difference was what each of them was hoping the clock would run out on. The field in the southwest corner was not an interesting experiment to Agravast. It was a problem. a problem that would become more complicated the longer it was allowed to develop into something that could be documented and defended. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February of 1997. It came in a white envelope from a law firm in Columbus, Aldrich, Penner and Associates, 14 pages, including attachments. The core of it was simple. Agravast Corporation held United States Patent Number 5678432 filed, March 1995, covering an integrated waterfowl soil cultivation method for agricultural wetland management, describing in precise technical language the practice of using domestic waterfowl in shallow managed impoundments to achieve soil compaction relief and organic nutrient cycling in wet agricultural ground. The letter stated that Elias Boone had been operating in violation of this patent for 3 growing seasons. It calculated damages at $47,000. It stated that continuing operations would require a licensing agreement and ongoing royalty. It stated that if he did not respond within 30 days, the corporation would proceed with litigation. Elias read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he set it down and looked at it. He had been farming this ground for 30 years. He had managed equipment failures and market crashes in 3 years of drought and 1 year of flooding so severe that the county road washed out and he could not get his grain to the elevator for 11 days. He had buried his father and his mother and 2 neighbors who had farmed beside him for decades. He had seen crop insurance adjusters look at a field that had cost him everything and write a number on a form that was less than what he had planted. He had learned over those 30 years that most of the difficult things that happen to a farmer are impersonal, the result of weather and markets, and the ordinary mechanical failures of equipment used past its design limits. They are not aimed at you, they are simply what happens. This letter was aimed at him. It had his name on it. It had been prepared by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who had calculated that the cost of fighting it would exceed the cost of compliance. $47,000 was a number selected with care. It was large enough to be serious, and small enough to be survivable if he chose to pay rather than fight. It was the price of a problem going away, framed as a debt he owed. The framing was the part that settled in his chest the way nothing else had in 30 years of farming this ground. June came in from outside, saw his face, and sat down across from him without speaking. He pushed the letter across the table. She read all 14 pages without stopping. When she finished, she set it down in the same place he had and looked at it the same way. She said, March 1995. He said 11 months after I started. She said they watched the first season and then filed. He said that is what the date says. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February fields were gray and still the sky the color of old concrete, the particular featureless sky of a Midwestern winter that makes the world look as though it has been paused mid-sentence. She said, your father's notebook. The Cross article. He said, I know. He got up from the table and went to the bookcase in the front room and took down the green ledger. He opened it to the page where the photocopy of the 1939 journal was folded between 2 pages of probe readings and unfolded it on the kitchen table next to the 14-page letter. Harlan Cross. Crawford County Agricultural Society Proceedings, Volume 4, Spring 1939. The letter from Columbus described a patent filed in March 1995. The article described the same method 56 years earlier in a publication that had been sitting in an unlocked storage room on the east side of Bucyrus since the society folded in 1962. He picked up the phone and called Raymond Keller at the county drainage office. Keller answered on the 3rd ring. Elias told him about the letter, the patent, the 1939 journal. There was a silence on Keller's end that lasted long enough to be its own statement. Keller said they filed a patent on a method that was published in 1939. Elias said the publication was not indexed in any national database. It was a local agricultural society journal from a county organization that no longer existed. He said he had found it through a handwritten notation in his father's composition book. Keller said, do you still have the photocopy? Elias said he did. Keller said he would come out that week. What Keller told Elias when he came and put in writing at Elias's request was this. The compaction disruption he had measured in the southeast quarter over the preceding 2 seasons was consistent with the application of exactly the method Cross had described in 1939. The probe data Elias had kept in the green ledger from the beginning of the first season represented the most thorough field documentation of the method's application on Crawford County soil that Keller had encountered in his professional work. The data was granular sequential and showed clear causation between the waterfowl pressure and the compaction relief that 2 rounds of drainage tile and 1 county soil survey had declared effectively permanent. Elias asked Keller directly whether he would be willing to state in a legal proceeding what he had just stated in that kitchen. Keller looked at the green ledger. He looked at the photocopy. He looked at the 14-page letter. He said they patented something that was already documented public knowledge and then waited to see who would use it so they could collect from them. Elias said that appeared to be the sequence. Keller said yes. He said he would testify. The 4 lawyers Elias called in the first 2 weeks after the letter arrived all said the same thing in different registers. The case had merit. Patent invalidity arguments based on prior art were recognized in federal court and had succeeded in cases with stronger resources than a farmer with a ledger book and a photocopied journal. But litigation against a corporation with Agravast's legal capacity would be costly. One lawyer put the minimum at $60,000. Another would not go below $90,000. A third did not return the second call. The 5th lawyer was the man named Gerald Weaver, who practiced out of a 2-room office above a hardware store in Bucyrus, 30 years in law. Most of it in agricultural property, disputes a man who owned 12 acres of bottomland east of town and farmed it himself on weekends. He drove out on a Saturday afternoon in March, walked the impoundment, sat at the kitchen table with all 4 documents spread out in front of him, and was quiet for a long time. Elias watched him read. Weaver was the kind of reader who did not move when he was reading something that mattered, the kind who understood that understanding is not a passive activity and gave it the physical stillness it required. He read the composition notebook first, all the way through, including the farm accounts at the front that had nothing to do with the case. Then the photocopy of the Cross article, all 11 pages. Then the green ledger, the probe readings going back to April 1994. The columns of numbers that had accumulated one morning at a time across 3.5 years. Then the 14-page letter from Aldrich Penner and Associates, which he read last and most slowly. Then he looked at this notation at the bottom of Walter Boone's second page, the handwriting small and careful. J. Crawford, Agricultural Society, Volume 4, 1939. He said your father wrote this in 1938. Elias said, October 1938. Weaver said, and you found the journal yourself. Elias said he had. Weaver turned the pages of the green ledger, reading the probe entries in the careful columns Elias had maintained from the first day of the first season. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he closed the ledger. He said they did not disclose the Cross article to the Patent Office when they filed. If they knew about it and failed to disclose it, that is inequitable conduct. The patent is not just invalid, it is unenforceable. Entirely. He said it quietly, the way a man states a conclusion he has arrived at carefully and does not need to repeat. He said he would take the case. The filing fee and Weaver's retainer came to $11,000 money. Elias did not have in a single account, but had across 3 accounts and a short-term operating line from the Farm Credit Office in Upper Sandusky. He transferred what he needed, signed what needed to be signed, and on a Wednesday morning in April of 1997, Gerald Weaver filed a response in the federal court for the Northern District of Ohio. The response ran to 42 pages. It contested the patent on grounds of prior art, citing the 1939 Crawford County Agricultural Society Journal. It contested the patent on grounds of inequitable conduct, alleging that Agravast had known about the Cross publication at the time of filing and failed to disclose it as required. It included as exhibits Walter Boone's composition notebook, Harlan Cross's 1939 article, Raymond Keller's written assessment, and 37 months of daily field entries from the Green Ledger. Gallagher called that same evening. Elias let June answer. She listened for a moment and said, "You will need to speak with our attorney," and gave him Gerald Weaver's number above the hardware store in Bucyrus. She came back to the kitchen and sat down. She said he did not sound like a man who was expecting that response. Elias said no. Outside, the April evening was settling into the fields, and in the southwest corner, the impoundment held its shallow water, and the ducks moved in their slow, deliberate patterns through the darkening water, doing what they had been doing since the first Tuesday morning 3 springs ago, when a man in a rusted truck opened a gate and stepped back and watched to see what they already knew how to do. Federal court in the Northern District of Ohio does not move quickly. That was the first thing Weaver told Elias after the filing, standing in the parking lot behind the hardware store with his coat collar turned up against the March wind. He said opposing counsel would respond. There would be motions delays built into the process by design because delay favors the party with more resources, and both sides understood that. He said Elias should expect the better part of a year and should plan accordingly. Elias said he had been farming this ground for 30 years and intended to keep doing so regardless of what the calendar in a federal courthouse said. Weaver looked at him for a moment. He said that was the correct answer. He planted the ducks on the second Tuesday of April 1997. The same week of the month, he had planted them every year since the beginning. He backed the truck to the gate, lifted the crates down, opened the gate, and stepped back. The lead birds walked to the water's edge and read it. Then they went in. Agrivast's response arrived in Weaver's office 12 days later, 61 pages. It contested the relevance of the Crawford County Agricultural Society Journal on the grounds that the publication had not been indexed in any nationally recognized agricultural literature database and therefore did not constitute prior art under the USPTO standard. It contested Keller's qualifications as an expert witness on soil compaction methodology. It submitted a declaration from Agrivast's own patent counsel stating that a thorough prior art search had been conducted before the 1995 filing, and the cross-publication had not appeared in any recognized database search. Weaver called Elias that evening. He said they are arguing that because the journal was not in a database, it does not count. Elias said it was on a shelf in a county storage room. Any person who walked through the door could read it. Weaver said that is exactly what we are going to argue. He said the standard for prior art is whether information was publicly available, not whether it was conveniently findable. A journal, published by a recognized agricultural organization and stored in a public county facility, met that standard regardless of what commercial databases had chosen to index. He said, but the inequitable conduct argument is stronger than the prior art argument, and Agrivast's lawyers know it. Establishing that argument requires showing they knew about the cross-publication and deliberately withheld it. Knowledge is the harder element to prove. He said they would need discovery. The discovery process carried them through the summer and into the fall. Agrivast was required to produce internal communications and research files related to the patent application. Weaver reviewed what arrived and asked for more, the back and forth moving slowly the way it is designed to move when one side has more to lose from speed than the other. Elias farmed through it. The fourth season of the impoundment was the most productive yet. The probe readings in September showed compaction disruption at 9 of the 12 monitoring points. The water in the impoundment ran clear enough by mid-August that he could see the bottom in the shallows, which meant the biological cycle Cross had described in 1939 had completed its first full rotation in that soil. The field was beginning to function as a system rather than an experiment. He thought sometimes during that fourth season about what the field would have been if his father had tried it in 1938. What would have happened to those 22 acres if Walter Boone had read the Cross article when it came out in the spring of 1939 and ordered 30 birds from a hatchery that summer? What the probe readings would have shown by 1945. What the ground would have become by 1960 when Elias was 17 years old and learning to read a field by walking behind his father. He didn't dwell on these thoughts because dwelling was not useful, but he noticed them the way you notice the gap between what happened and what might have happened, and he let them pass the way a farmer lets unproductive weather pass, which is without argument and without prolonged mourning. The knowledge had existed. The ground had been waiting. The timing had not been right for his father, and then it had not been right for 30 more years, and then finally, a February afternoon in a basement with a cedar trunk and an unlocked latch, and a son who was tired enough of failing at the same thing to read all the way to the back of a nickel notebook. That was how it happened. Not with clarity or intention, but with the accumulation of ordinary circumstances arriving at an angle that let one thing lead to the next. He was grateful for the angle. He tried not to calculate the cost of the decades before it. Keller came out twice that summer without being asked. Brought his instruments, took readings, updated his written assessment. He did not discuss the litigation. He discussed the soil. That was the right approach, and Elias appreciated it without saying so. Dale stopped on the county road in August, got out of the C-10, and walked to the fence line without being invited. He stood there for several minutes looking at the impoundment. The water was clear, and the birds were working the far margin, and the rebuilt east berm stood solid and unmarked. Dale said your east berm held through that July rain. Elias said it had. Dale said you changed the lift sequence on the rebuild. Elias said he had packed shorter and let each course dry longer. Dale looked at the berm another moment. He said, "That is what I would have done." He got back in the truck and drove on. Elias watched him go and thought that some understandings between men do not require any more words than the ones they have already exchanged. It was November when Weaver called about the document that changed everything. His voice carried a quality Elias had not heard in it before, a controlled steadiness that in a man like Weaver signaled something significant rather than something wrong. Weaver said in the discovery production we received last week, there is an internal memorandum from AgriVast's research division, dated September 1994, 7 months before the patent was filed. Elias waited. Weaver said the memorandum was addressed to the head of AgriVast's intellectual property development team. It described a survey of historical literature on wetland agricultural practices conducted in preparation for a potential patent filing. It listed 4 publications the survey had identified as potentially relevant. The 4th item was described as a regional agricultural society publication from Crawford County, Ohio, dating to 1939, authored by an agronomist named H. Cross, describing integrated waterfowl cultivation methods for wet agricultural ground. The silence on the line was Elias making sure he had understood correctly. Weaver said they found it 7 months before they filed. They listed it in an internal memorandum, and then they did not disclose it to the patent office. Elias said they knew. Weaver said they knew. He said that was no longer an allegation. It was a document in their own handwriting produced in discovery because they were required to apparently gambling. It would not surface cleanly enough to be usable. He said the gamble had not paid off. He said, inequitable conduct before the USPTO, proven with this kind of direct documentary evidence, does not simply invalidate the patent, it renders it permanently unenforceable. It opens the corporation to Rule 11 sanctions for filing a frivolous legal action when they knew the patent was invalid, and it attracts the attention of the USPTO's own enforcement office, which has authority to pursue the attorneys who signed the application. Elias looked out the kitchen window. The November fields were brown and still. The impoundment was drained for the winter, the berm standing solid against the gray sky. He said, "What happens now?" Weaver said he would file a supplemental motion with the September 1994 memorandum as Exhibit A and request summary judgment on both the invalidity and inequitable conduct claims. He said AgriVast's counsel would know what the memorandum meant the moment the filing arrived in their office, because it meant exactly what it appeared to mean, and there was no interpretation of it favorable to their client. He said he expected AgriVast would want to settle before a hearing. Elias said he was not interested in settling. There was a pause. Weaver said he understood that. He said what AgriVast had done was not simply file an aggressive patent claim against a small farmer. They had filed a fraudulent application with the federal government and then threatened a man they knew had a prior art defense gambling. He would not have the resources or the documentation to use it. He said that deserved a public record and a federal court finding, not a confidential settlement agreement. He said we go to the hearing. Elias set the phone down and looked out the window at the November fields for a while. He thought about the September 1994 memorandum. He thought about what it meant that someone at AgriVast had found the Cross article and put it on a list, and then the list had gone to the intellectual property team, and the intellectual property team had filed the patent application the following March without disclosing it. He thought about the chain of decisions required for that sequence to occur. Someone had read the 4th item on the list and understood what it meant and decided to proceed anyway. That was not a mistake or an oversight. It was a choice, and the choice was based on a calculation, which was that a farmer in Crawford County with a damaged wet field and no legal team would not be able to find what they had found, would not be able to prove it, even if he found it, and would not be able to afford the litigation, even if he could prove it. The calculation was precise and rational and completely wrong on all 3 counts, because the farmer in Crawford County had a father who had written things down carefully in 1938, because the farmer in Crawford County had spent 3.5 years building a record in a green ledger that documented every morning of every season in numbers that did not argue or interpret but simply stated what the ground had done. And because the farmer in Crawford County had found a lawyer above a hardware store who owned 12 acres of bottomland east of town and farmed it on weekends, and understood what was at stake in a way that the attorneys at Aldrich Penner and Associates with their rolling case of files and their portable projector would not fully comprehend until they were sitting in a federal courtroom in Toledo in February watching a document they had produced in discovery appear on an overhead projector. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of February 1998 in the federal courthouse in Toledo. Weaver drove. Elias sat in the passenger seat with the green ledger on his lap and the composition notebook in a manila envelope on the seat beside him, and the photocopy of the 1939 Crawford County Agricultural Society Journal folded in the breast pocket of his good coat, the same place he had carried it the day he drove home from that storage room nearly 3 years ago. June rode in the back seat. She had not discussed whether she would come. She had simply been at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning when Weaver's car came down the lane, coat on, hands folded. Elias had looked at her when he came downstairs, and she had looked back at him, and neither of them had said anything about it because there was nothing that needed to be said. She had been at this from the beginning. She had been sitting on the porch in October of 1993 when he first said the thing out loud. She had been the one who got up and brought the composition notebook from the bookcase when he found the Cross article. She had been the one at the bedroom window who heard the berm give before he did. She had answered Gallagher's call and given him Gerald Weaver's number above the hardware store without asking Elias whether that was what he wanted because she already knew. She had been attending to this the entire time with the same quality of attention she had brought to every other thing in their life together, not loudly or declaratively, but completely and without asking to be acknowledged for it. She was going to Toledo, because of course she was going to Toledo. That was all there was to say about it. The federal courthouse in Toledo is a building designed to communicate the weight of what happens inside it. Stone floors, high ceilings, winter light coming through tall windows at a low angle that made everything in the room cast longer shadows than it would elsewhere. Elias had been inside it once before, years ago, for a property boundary dispute resolved before reaching a hearing room. He remembered the sound of it, the way footsteps carried differently in a space where the ceiling intends for sound to travel. Aldrich, Penner and Associates had sent 2 attorneys, both younger than Gallagher, both in the dark suits of people who spend their working lives in rooms like this one. They carried a rolling case of files, a laptop and a portable projector that took them 15 minutes to set up at their table. The projector threw a rectangle of white light on the wall behind them, bright and waiting, the visual language of presentations designed to fill a room. Weaver set the green ledger on the table. He set the manila envelope containing the composition notebook beside it. He placed the photocopy of the 1939 journal on top, face-up, staple-bound edges worn at the corners. The cover print faded to the color of old straw. No projector, no laptop. 3 objects on a table arranged in the order they had entered the story. The 2 attorneys looked at what was on Weaver's table. They looked at each other. Then they looked back at their own table, and the portable projector, and the rolling case, and the rectangle of white light on the wall, and something in the configuration of those 2 tables, in the contrast between them, seemed to settle something in the room before anyone had said a word. Judge Patricia Weaver. No relation to Gerald, was 60 years old and had been on the federal bench for 11 years. She read the papers before her with the attention of someone who understood that reading carefully is how you make the subsequent conversation shorter. She asked 4 questions before the formal proceeding began, all of them addressed to the document record. All 4 answered by what was already in the filings. The hearing ran to 3 hours and 40 minutes. Weaver presented 2 objects to the court. The first was the green ledger, 47 months of daily field entries in one man's handwriting columns of numbers that did not argue or interpret, but simply recorded what the ground had done one morning at a time across nearly 4 years. The second was the photocopy of 11 pages from a staple-bound journal published in Crawford County in the spring of 1939. He said the man who found that journal had not used a legal database or a research service. He had used a handwritten notation his father had left at the bottom of a page in a nickel composition book, followed by a drive to a county storage building, a conversation with a clerk, and 40 minutes in a room that had been waiting for someone to come asking. He said the argument that a corporation with a dedicated research division could not have done the same was one the court was free to evaluate on its merits. The attorneys from Aldrich, Penner objected twice. The judge sustained neither objection. Weaver placed the September 1994 internal memorandum on the overhead projector. The 4th item on the list appeared in the center of the rectangle of light on the wall. Agravast's own letterhead at the top, the research division's own language describing the Cross article by name, by author, by county of origin, by year. The courtroom went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a document does the work that argument cannot improve on. Weaver said the patent was filed in March 1995. This memorandum is dated September 1994. The Cross article appears on page 2, item 4, identified by name. Agravast's own research division found it, described it, and communicated its existence to the intellectual property team 7 months before filing. The USPTO received no disclosure. The letter demanding $47,000 from my client was sent to a man whose use of the method predated the patent filing, by parties who were aware that the patent rested on an undisclosed prior art document. We are asking the court to so find on the record and to assess Rule 11 sanctions accordingly. Raymond Keller testified for 40 minutes. He presented his probe data from the 1996 and 1997 site, visits the soil compaction readings at each monitoring point, the pattern of disruption in the movement corridors, and his professional assessment of the mechanism by which waterfowl pressure had achieved what 2 generations of drainage tile installation had not. He was precise and unhurried, and he answered every question from opposing counsel with the same even factual clarity he had brought to the field visits. When the attorney asked whether the disruption could have been caused by some other mechanism, Keller said that it was theoretically possible, that he had considered it, and that he had not found evidence of any other mechanism consistent with the observed pattern. The attorney asked whether Keller had any financial relationship with the Boone family or any interest in the outcome of the proceeding. Keller said he worked for Crawford County and had conducted both site visits in the course of his regular duties. The attorney had no further questions. Judge Weaver asked Keller directly whether in his professional assessment the method described in the Cross article and the method employed by Elias Boone in the Crawford County impoundment were the same method. Keller said they were. The judge made a note and looked at the opposing table. Agrivast's lead attorney stood. He was composed and thorough, and he made the arguments available to him with skill. He argued that the prior art standard required the cross-publication to be indexed in a recognized database to constitute constructive notice to the USPTO. He argued that internal research memoranda reflected preliminary investigation rather than definitive findings, and that failure to disclose a preliminary finding was not the same as deliberate non-disclosure. He argued that Elias Boone's field records, while diligent, had not been validated by an independent third party under controlled conditions. He argued for 40 minutes. Judge Weaver listened without interruption. When he finished, she looked at her notes. She looked at the photocopy of the 1939 journal on Weaver's table. She looked at the green ledger. She said, "Counsel, I have one question. The memorandum dated September 1994 describes the cross-publication in specific detail, including author name, county of origin, and year of publication. Is it the position of Agrivast Corporation that this description appeared in an internal document without anyone at Agrivast having read the underlying publication?" The attorney said the memorandum reflected a preliminary identification in the course of a broader survey, and that whether the publication itself had been reviewed by anyone at Agrivast was not established by the document. The judge looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "The motion for summary judgment on prior art grounds is granted. The patent is invalid. The motion on inequitable conduct grounds is granted. The patent is unenforceable, and the court finds that the failure to disclose the cross-publication to the USPTO was not inadvertent. Sanctions under Rule 11 are appropriate given that the demand letter was sent to a party whose use of the method predated the patent filing, with knowledge that the patent rested on an undisclosed prior art document." She set a sanctions figure and directed payment to Weaver's office within 60 days. She said the record of the proceeding would be forwarded to the USPTO's Office of Enrollment and Discipline for review of the conduct of the attorneys who had signed the original patent application. She closed her file and left the bench. Elias sat still for a moment. The two attorneys from Aldrich Penner were speaking quietly to each other. The portable projector was being packed away. The rectangle of white light on the wall disappeared. Weaver was writing in his legal pad with the absorbed attention he brought to everything he wrote. Elias looked back at June. She was seated in the second row, her hands in her lap the way they had been on the porch that October evening in 1993 when he had first said the thing out loud, and she met his eyes across the room with the same steadiness she had brought to that night. The steadiness of a person who had already decided that whatever came was something they would face without flinching. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was the whole of it. They drove home through an afternoon that had gone gray and still the Ohio fields flat and brown on either side of the highway. Nobody said much for a long time. Weaver drove and kept his thoughts to himself, which was the right approach for a man who had just won something and understood that the win belonged to someone else. After a while, Elias said the USPTO review. What does that mean for the attorneys who filed? Weaver said the Office of Enrollment and Discipline had authority to sanction up to and including disbarment from practice before the Patent Office. He said the outcome of that review was not something they would control, but that the court's finding of deliberate non-disclosure was the kind of finding that office took seriously. Elias said, and Gallagher. Weaver said Gallagher had signed the demand letter personally as Regional Land Acquisition Director, and that his name appeared in the internal memorandum routing chain as one of 3 recipients of the September 1994 research summary. He said the court's finding of deliberate non-disclosure with Gallagher's name in the document trail was the kind of thing that ended careers rather than pausing them. He said he had heard from a contact at Aldrich Penner that Gallagher had been placed on administrative leave the morning the supplemental motion was filed 4 months before the hearing, and that the leave had become permanent 3 weeks after the ruling. He said he did not know what Gallagher was doing now, and that it was not something he spent time thinking about. Elias said he did not either. He looked out the passenger window at a field of winter wheat coming up green along a south-facing slope, bright against the gray of the rest of the landscape, the kind of green that appears in February in Ohio on ground that drains well and has been managed carefully over a long time. He thought about the man who farmed that field, and whether that man knew how fortunate he was to have ground that drained the way it was supposed to drain. Probably not. You do not know what you have until you have spent 30 years trying to fix what you do not. That was the lesson of the low corner, if there was a lesson which he doubted, because lessons implied that the point of a thing was to teach you something, and he had come to believe that the point of a thing was usually just itself. He said, I need to get the ducks back in the water in 6 weeks. Weaver smiled. A real smile, not the practice kind. He said, yes, I expect you do. The sanctions check arrived at Weaver's office on the 53rd day of the 60-day window, which Weaver noted without comment. The USPTO letter, confirming receipt of the court's referral and the opening of a formal review, arrived the following week. Both documents went into the green ledger in a section Elias started at the back, separated from the probe readings and field notes by 3 blank pages. The same way his father had separated the practical from the speculative in the notebook kept in 1938. Raymond Keller called in March to say that a soil scientist from Ohio State University had contacted him about the compaction data from the Crawford County impoundment and asked whether Elias would allow a research team access during the upcoming season. Keller said the researcher had described the impoundment as a documented case study of preferential compaction relief through repeated waterfowl pressure, and that the field records going back to 1994 represented the most complete data set of its kind available in the peer-reviewed literature. Elias said he would think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. He walked the field each of those mornings in the early light before the frost came out of the ground, checking the berm and the outlet pipe and the soil surface in the shallows. The berm had come through the winter clean. The outlet pipe had held. The surface of the dry impoundment showed the particular texture of ground that has been worked by waterfowl for 4 seasons. A fine, granular quality at the surface over a subsurface that the probe entered now with a resistance different from 3 years ago. Not the unyielding compression of permanently waterlogged clay, but something that had structure to it that had been broken and reorganized along lines of pressure rather than left to compact under its own weight. On the second morning, he stopped at the southeast corner and pushed the probe into the ground at the point where the fracturing had been deepest in the last set of readings. The probe went in smoothly to 11 inches before it met the kind of resistance that told him something was still there beneath the disrupted layer, unchanged the lower stratum of the compaction that would take more seasons to reach. He wrote the number in the ledger. Then he stood up and looked at the field. Cross had written in 1939 that the method required patience, and that patience was not the absence of urgency, but the correct application of it. He had meant it as agricultural advice about not removing the birds too early, or flooding at the wrong depth, or expecting results in a single season. But standing at the southeast corner in March with the probe in his hand and the ledger under his arm, Elias understood it as something larger than agricultural advice. Patience was not waiting. Patience was continuing to do the necessary work on the necessary schedule, regardless of whether anyone was watching or understanding or approving of what you were doing. His father had had that patience. Cross had had it. The ground itself had it. The compaction layer had been accumulating for decades, and it was releasing at the same rate it needed to release, no faster, according to no schedule, except the one the pressure and the biology and the time required. He called Keller back on the 3rd day and said the research team was welcome in the field, after the birds went in, but not before, and that any soil sampling would need to be at points he specified, because disrupting the monitoring locations he had maintained since 1994 would break the continuity of the record. Keller said he would convey those terms. Elias said, "Tell them the green ledger is available for review if they want the full data set." He said it was not going anywhere. The ducks went in the third week of April 1998, a Tuesday, the same week of the month it had always been. Elias backed the truck to the gate and lifted the crates down and opened the gate and stepped back. The lead birds walked to the water's edge and read it. Then one went in and then the others followed, and the sound they made in the shallow water was the sound Elias had come to know. The way he knew the sound of his own fields in every kind of weather. The soft rhythmic pressing of things that have learned a place through long attention and return to it without hesitation. Dale came by the first week of May. He parked on the county road, Shoulder got out and walked to the fence line. They stood there together for a while without speaking, watching the birds work the eastern margin in the morning light. The water was clear, and the birds moved the way they always moved, in the slow, overlapping patterns that had not changed from the first day Elias had opened the gate 4 years ago. Patterns that followed the bottom of the impoundment along lines that only the birds understood, and that showed up in the probe readings as the corridors where the compaction had fractured deepest. Dale said that East Berm has not moved. Elias said no, it has not. Dale looked at the impoundment for another moment. He said, "How did the court business come out?" Elias said it had come out the right way. Dale nodded. He didn't ask for details. He understood without being told that if a man says a thing came out the right way, it came out the way he needed it to, and that the details beyond that were his own business. He looked at the field one more time at the ducks moving in their slow, overlapping patterns, and then he walked back to the truck and drove on. The Ohio State research team arrived in late June, 4 of them, with equipment cases and a graduate student who took photographs. The lead researcher was a woman in her 50s, who moved through the field with the attention of someone who had spent a career studying ground and knew what she was looking at. She spent the better part of 2 days at the monitoring points Elias had specified, running her own instruments alongside his probe, comparing her readings against the columns in the green ledger. On the second afternoon, she stood at the south fence line with the ledger open to the September 1994 entries and compared them against what her instruments were showing her now. She was quiet for a long time. The silence was the right kind, the silence of someone doing genuine thinking rather than the silence of someone preparing to speak. She said, "You have been keeping this record since the beginning." He said he had. She said, "Your father's notebook, the cross article, the notation about the journal. Did you understand at the time what you were looking at?" He said he had understood that his father had taken the information seriously enough to write it down carefully, and that his father was not a man who wrote things down carelessly. She looked at the ducks working the far margin, 30 of them, the same number there had always been. They were in the east corridor, the one where the fracturing was deepest, moving in their slow, deliberate way that had not changed since the first afternoon he had opened the gate. She said the compaction disruption at the primary monitoring corridor is consistent with what you would expect from 5 full seasons of continuous pressure application. The fracture pattern is following the movement lines exactly as Cross predicted in the article. The soil profile in the southeast quarter reads as agriculturally viable ground. She paused. She said she had not seen a data set this complete from a single operator field study. She said most researchers would have stopped measuring after the second season when the results became clear. She said the fact that he had kept going said something about the man as much as it said something about the method. She closed the ledger and held it out to him. She said this record is going to matter to people who were not here to see it happen. He took the ledger. He stood there for a moment holding it, feeling the weight of 4 years of mornings in his hands. He thought about his father sitting at a kitchen table in 1938, writing down what a man named Cross had told him about wet ground and ducks, and the patience required to understand what a field was trying to say. He thought about the 3 blank pages his father had left between the practical and the speculative, and how that small act of separation was itself a kind of knowledge. The understanding that some things need room to breathe before they are ready to be used. He thought about the cedar trunk and the unlocked latch and the afternoon in the basement and the 2 years the notebook had spent on the bookcase before he walked out onto the porch in October and said the thing out loud to the person he should have said it to from the beginning. He thought about how long a thing can wait when it is written down carefully. He said it is my father's record as much as mine. The paper came out the following spring in an agricultural soil science journal. Weaver brought a copy on a Saturday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table the way he had sat the day he agreed to take the case. He didn't stay long. He set the journal on the table, told Elias where the citations were, and left. He understood that what had been accomplished was Elias's and June's, and through the composition notebook, Walter Boone's, and that his own contribution was in the category of things that were necessary and complete and did not require additional acknowledgement. The citation in the footnotes referenced the 1939 Crawford County Agricultural Society proceedings. Volume 4, authored by H. Cross in the Field Records of E. Boone, Crawford County, Ohio, 1994 through 1998. Below that, in the same font as everything else, were the words, Original Field Documentation, maintained by W. Boone, 1938, Crawford County, Ohio Composition Notebook Family Collection. Elias read that line twice. June was at the kitchen window when he read it. He did not say anything. He set the journal on the table, and she came over and read the page, and then stood with her hand resting on it for a moment, the way a person rests their hand on something they want to be sure is real. Then she took her hand away and went back to what she had been doing, which was the right response, because there was nothing more that needed to happen. The thing was done. The record was complete. Walter Boone's name was in a footnote in a scientific journal where it would stay for as long as journals were kept, and the ground in the southwest corner of the farm, 11 miles south of Bucyrus, was different from the ground it had been 6 years ago. Not because of a machine or a chemical or another run of drainage tile, but because a retired agronomist had stood at its edge on a gray October afternoon in 1938 and told a 23-year-old farmer something worth writing down. And the farmer had written it down, and the notebook had waited in a cedar trunk for 54 years until someone came down a set of basement stairs at the right angle and opened the lid. The morning after Weaver brought the journal, Elias went out before 5 the way he did every morning in that season. The impoundment was drained for the winter, and the surface of the southeast quarter showed the fine granular texture of ground that has been changed not dramatically or all at once, but in the accumulating patient way that real change always happens, one season pressing against the next. One set of feet working the same corridor 10,000 times until the ground beneath understood what was being asked of it and gave way. He walked the east berm. He walked the outlet pipe. He checked the 17 monitoring stakes, counting them, the way he always counted them, the line of them tracing the same diagonal crease across the field he had first marked in the frozen February of 1994, when his breath came out in small clouds, and he had understood for the first time that the crease in the ground was not a flaw he had inherited, but information he had not yet learned to read. He stood at the south edge for a while. The morning was cold and still. The fields of Crawford County stretched away in every direction, under a sky moving from black toward the gray-blue of pre-dawn, that particular color that belongs to the hour before the world decides what kind of day it intends to be. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about his father. He thought about the 89 years between the first furrow broken in 1909 and this morning in 1999, and about everything that had happened on this ground in that time, and everything that had been learned and forgotten and rediscovered and finally written down where it could not be lost again. 3 generations of Boones had farmed this county road. The first had broken the ground. The second had discovered the answer to its oldest problem. The third had finally used it. That was how families worked on land they kept, not linearly, not with clean transmission of knowledge from father to son to grandson, but in the slow, imprecise way that all real knowledge moved through notebooks and cedar trunks and conversations on autumn afternoons and mornings walked in February with the water pattern frozen into the surface of the ground where it could finally be read. You did not always receive what the generation before you had learned. Sometimes you found it. Sometimes it waited for you in a place you had not thought to look until you were tired enough of not knowing to open every trunk in the basement at the right angle. Then he went inside. June had the kitchen lamp on. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and washed his hands and sat down. She set a cup of coffee on the table without looking up from what she was reading, the same motion she had made on 10,000 mornings before this one patient, and unhurried and completely without ceremony, the way the most permanent things move. He opened the green ledger to a fresh page. He wrote the date at the top. Below it, the morning temperature, the sky conditions, the state of the berm and the outlet pipe, and the 17 stakes. He wrote in small, even columns the way his father had written without interpretation, letting the numbers carry what they knew how to carry. The 5th season was 6 weeks away.
horizon, certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never